Hi, this is the Libram Society, a literary live show about all sorts of interesting genre literature. I'm Arlen Walker, and I'm joined by.
Jason Hobbs, the man that no, just Jason Hobbs. Hi everybody, I'm Jason, and today is not the Malazan books. It is our other week when we're talking about some short stories, and currently we're delving into pre-fantasy literature, or maybe something else. And we have a most prestigious guest who is not wearing a toga, even though we did say there was a dress code. Just kidding. He is a Plunderground zine, and There and Back Again are some great things that he has accomplished. And I have to say, he is one of the guys I admire a lot in our little cottage industry. He is none other than Ray Otus. How you doing, Ray?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
How did you like that introduction? Did I make you uncomfortable?
Prestigious was a little over the top, maybe. Yeah.
All right, so we are here, guys. I'm just going to get us all together. We should thank Arlen for the new overlay. We got hopefully a raucous crowd. You got anybody over there yet, Arlen?
Fred Daniel is excited that it's time for Libram Society.
All right. Well, welcome, Fred Daniel. He's actually a guy who watches quite a bit this and another show that Arlen and I are both players of, Ray. So nice job, Fred. We appreciate it, buddy.
Watches a lot of my stuff, too, on YouTube. Actually, I get comments from him a lot.
Fred, keep it going, brother. We appreciate it. All right, you guys. I don't even know how we started this show last time. Oh, we're going to do the segment is what we're going to say is called Did You Know? Where we're going to say something maybe about the author, and so we can talk about what he did or the story, how it affected us. And I already skipped Did You Know? So I'm going to let one of you guys go for it. Ray, you want to go as the guest?
Sure. So this is a Did You Know about William Hope Hodgson?
Sure.
Specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, did you know that he ran away at age 13 to become a sailor? And even though he was dragged back to his little school, he managed to escape the following year. And so he started sailing at age 14.
Where was he sailing?
Out of England. So he was an apprentice cabin boy, which has got to be like the lowest position on a ship for sure.
Yeah, that just means like the empties the privy bucket or something, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. In fact, there's a kind of this interesting side note. Bullying cabin boys is a little bit of a literary motif that he gets into in some of his sea tales. Apparently, he himself was bullied quite a bit, and so then he became kind of a physical trainer, and he was very physical the rest of his life, and he apparently could hold his own.
So you're saying that in the comic books, the guy on the beach with the sand in his face, he was like the guy, right. And then later he got up. So, hey, we got
he did the Charles Atlas.
Yeah, we got Beast King 1980 on the old Twitch. Welcome, my man. Hope you enjoy the raucous show today. What about you, Arlen? You got something to add? What do we know about this guy?
Well, I got a comment on YouTube. A nice overlay. Glad you chose this one. So.
Did you write that yourself?
I did not write that myself. That's Super Beast. No, but I was going to add William Hope Hodgson at the other end of his life died in 1918 as an artillery officer in the First World War. He was killed by a shell, and that was that at age 40, and wrote a lot of stuff in between being a cabin boy and World War I. So a prolific,
amazing life. He was amazing author. 6 novels, about 100 short stories, and 4 poetry collections, all in his 40 short years of life, along with a bunch of other stuff that he got done. So I'm already a little intimidated. Well, he ran a school for a while. He
the thing he fled from. He started.
He did a lot of. I know that doesn't seem crazy. That seems a little crazy. He sailed for I don't know. It sounded about 10 years, I guess. He did a lot of photography. He was kind of into experimental photography and did spirit photography, which is that kind of double exposed stuff of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Just lots of interesting things.
So this particular story, which is what we did last time, where we're letting our guests choose what the story is that we're talking about. 1907 is what it said. This was printed in a magazine. Is that correct? The short story
Yeah,
magazine.
Blue Book magazine. Yep.
And like, what made you choose this story specifically?
I chose this story because it's not mentioned much, for one thing. I don't hear a lot about it. It actually has been adapted into a movie and a TV show, at least once of each, and has been copied a number of times. But I find it, for a story, a very short story, by the way. I was being very nice to you guys by picking out something that you could basically read on the toilet. But
Taking a pee too, not number two.
Number one. For a very short story, I think it ages really well. It really captures horror, and for me, the tie-in with kind of fantasy is this the idea of like fungus and body horror and some of the things that go on in here that I think is pretty interesting for the time. I know that one of his other books, which I've not read, I think it was called The Boats of Glen Carrig, was China Mieville said that that's where he thinks Lovecraft got his tentacle horror from. So he was a early weird horror voice.
Are you supposed to add a syllable in China Melville's name? I've always been saying it wrong.
I don't know. I see the vowels there and I go for them. China Mieville.
I like it.
Yeah.
I'd like
unlike Arlen's in Texas, and he sees a vowel and he makes three of them, even when there's only one, right?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard Mieville's name spoken, so I have no idea how you're supposed to say it.
I've talked about it with other people, and I always just say Melville. I don't know, but I'm the lowbrow here. I wasn't planning ever on wearing a ascot or like Arlen's.
I know.
Snuggie.
Arlen showed up in a smoking jacket and ascot. We're all a little jealous here.
Yeah,
it looks suspiciously like a hoodie and a blanket, but that's definitely what it is.
That's not a Snuggie, is it?
No, it's just
a snugging jacket.
Weird shaped blanket, basically, to wear.
Oh, sorry, Arlen. I feel like we're bullying you like you were a apprentice cabin boy.
He's the honorary cabin boy of this episode.
Mm-hmm. That should have been that. I think that would have went way better than Redheaded Stepchild. We should have I'm just bullying you like, yeah, I like it. All right, so why don't we get into the story itself, and then we can bust out how we could like use this in a game, or maybe like its inspiration in later books and all that. So what do you think, Arlen? Do you want to like break into the first scene here and maybe like your feelings about it?
Yeah, so the story is kind of told in two parts. There's a first part where we have our narrator, who I don't remember if he is named or not, George. Yeah, and Will, the other character that is on the boat. They're on a fishing boat in the Pacific. Not quite sure where they are. They know they're in the North Pacific, I believe, but they're having trouble kind of navigating because of haze over the sun and the stars and all that sort of stuff. And it's at night, and it's not a stormy night, but a kind of eerie night. And there is this voice that calls out to our sort of viewpoint character who's on watch on the ship, or the boat, really, because it's not it doesn't seem to be a full kind of ship size. It's fairly small, and this progresses into a sort of back and forth dialogue where they end up giving this character food. He seems to be desperate and starving, and that there's another person, a woman, involved in this character's party, who won't come close to the light, who won't kind of show his face, keeps kind of staying away from the boat and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, this mysterious character leaves and then comes back, and the second half, or the second kind of 2/3 of the story, really, is this mysterious character telling the story of how he ended up in this odd position. And it's a tale of horror and weird fungus and all sorts of kind of interesting contrivances.
I really felt like it wasn't like when I was telling my wife about it, she doesn't really even read fantasy. She doesn't play role-playing games. She doesn't do any of that. But it's not like when you say horror today, it means something very different from the evocative eeriness that this story creates. And to me, this is like the horror that I would prefer almost over. Even, I mean, there is some body horror in it. I'm not saying there isn't, but it's more just this eerie kind of Lovecraftian internal, I don't know, feeling that you get, dread, almost this sort of dread that's created by the mood, like Beast King 1980 mentions. There's a mood. It's more mood than it is visual horror.
It's pre splatter horror. It's psychological horror. It's suspense. It's measured. I was trying to think about. There's a part of me that thinks this story takes a while to get going. There's this narrative frame, which is a literary technique that used to get used a lot and probably less so these days. But the idea of like a story within a story, right? And the frame is the thing that goes around it. I was trying to think why it's here. Like, what is it doing as a story? And so, yeah, Arlen did a good job of summarizing there. There's really none of the names of the people on the boat matter. Not really. There's really only two characters that are doing anything, and one of them is kind of trying to shine the light on this boat that is coming up alongside their boat, and another one is being the captain is being a little more reasonable and saying, no, don't worry about it. He's probably not gonna. One of the characters is a little wary that this person approaching them might have nefarious intent. But and so they kind of do a little bit of this jostling around with the lantern, and one point the lantern gets brought out and the guy in the boat or whoever's in the boat like immediately starts rowing away, and then they agree to put the light away and he comes back, and so it's a weird little little game of tag that's going on here, and I'm thinking what is it doing? Is it just setting the mood? Is it kind of working us into the story slowly? What did you guys think of this opening? Was it too slow?
Yeah. Why did he create this pre-framing? I think he needed someone for the story to be told to, because it's not like you could run into this guy, the character, I would say the protagonist, the true protagonist. You can't run into him in a bar somewhere, or he's not an old man telling you a story. There's some different ways to do it, but in some ways, you always think about, in horror today, people complain because the characters act ignorant in the face of the horror. Like they're not, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. They just kind of walk into things and people are like, oh, I would never do it that way. But this guy is immediately wary, right? And,
yes.
I wanted to mention that it was a dark, starless night. What's the famous line? It was a dark and stormy night. What's that from?
Right. It's from a turgid novel that was written ages and it was during the Gothic period, I think. I think before this, yeah. So but it's also used as there's a literary competition every year where they start out with that line and then everybody writes a story. It's kind of a joke.
But I mean, in some ways, you say it seems long, but I think within 5 paragraphs, he's already created this suspenseful feeling of in the reader, making you go like, all right, this. In some ways, this is not how I expect the story to start. And so it doesn't feel too long to me at all. In fact, you kind of learn a little bit about these two characters, where Will, like you said, is the captain, and he wants to be more trusting, like believes in the innocence of people, whereas the other guy, George, seems less so. That was my takeaway. And I definitely got that.
It also sets up this idea that
Go ahead.
It also sets up this idea that there's something so horrific that whoever's approaching is afraid that if they see him, they won't help him, or that they'll panic or something. So you think, then your mind starts racing, like what's going on? Yeah, what could be that horrific?
The friendly monster or something, right? The monster kind of idea of Frankenstein. I don't know. What do you think, Arlen? You haven't said much. What do you think about this framing this early?
Yeah, I think the idea that you set up, I think one of the things that this type of horror is really dependent on is kind of grounding in a lot of ways, right? That in order to capture the eerie tone, you need at least one foot on the other side that is saying, like, we know what the real world is like, and we have experience of it, and we have some access to it, even as we get kind of pulled further and further into this sort of eerie supernatural version of reality. And I think, to me, that's, I think, what the framing in this story really does, is it gives us a really strong sense of the kind of reality of these two characters who are worried about what is going on in this kind of weird situation. And then once we get into this sort of strange story that the man in the boat tells, we have that kind of always in the back of our minds as this is sort of, more so than other framing devices, that I think there are a lot of frames, especially in earlier literature, where you're sort of expected to have, a sort of passing memory of it. I think this is a much stronger frame, partly because it occupies a lot more of the story, and that you're supposed to have a lot more sense of, like, what are Will and George thinking about this story as they're being told this story, as opposed to some stories where I think you're not really supposed to think about the frame until you get, except at the start and at the end, and it's like, oh, I remember this was a character telling a story.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I really liked, almost like, pretty early, he has this indefinite suspicion, which kind of creates that eerie mood that we're talking about. Just that, those two words put together make me feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
When he first hears the voice, he has an indefinite suspicion where you, like, set in this limbo of you're not sure what's going to happen, which I really liked. I have to admit, I was more, that's what we were going to do. We were going to talk about how we thought we were going to like our first impression, and then what we thought afterwards, after talking to each other. Arlen, wasn't that something we wanted to do?
That was something we talked about. Yeah, why don't we do that? We'll go around, everybody say kind of what they thought about the story before we get too into it.
Okay, so I didn't really know much going in, so I will say, after I read it, I actually really liked it, because I really liked the idea of this mood that it creates, or this aesthetic that it has, because this is almost kind of how I feel like my players feel whenever they're playing my games, when they're not laughing at the goofiness of just the jokes on the outside, but if they're looking through the actual character's lens, this is what I think they feel like what is going to happen next. I'm very uncomfortable. And then there's actual body horror too. A lot. When it gets really lurid details. So I was a pretty big fan. I didn't know what to think. It was easier to read this and grasp what was going on than it was the HoloLand, for sure. So what about you, Ray? Do you have any initial thoughts, like what you think? And then, like, we're going to come back at the end of the show and see what we think after everyone else speaks about it.
Right. So for me, I think I discovered this when I was hunting down some audio audiobook files at some point. I got a random bunch of short stories that were out there in the public domain. And when I came across this one, I was kind of shocked at how great it was for a story from 1907, first of all. And so my general impression of the story, rereading it, is, yes, it's a great little story. It's focused. It's about a focused moment in time. It's about a focused bit of horror. It communicates a feeling very strongly, and then it gets off of it, right? It's pretty economically written. And I think it's just a really great, like, if I were making an anthology of short, weird horror stories, this one would be in there for me. It's really a prototype for a lot of things.
Yeah. What about you, Arlen?
I can't remember if I've read this story before or not. I've read a couple of William Hope Hodgson stories. I have a collection of his books that I read, a collection of his stories that I read at least about half of, I think. So William Hope Hodgson, for me, some of it I really liked, and some of it I thought kind of like, it's all right, but it's not quite as strong as the other stuff, I guess. This one I liked a lot. I thought it was a lot of fun. I really enjoy, kind of like you were saying, Hobbs, the kind of flavor of horror that I think is so so tied to tonal control and so tied to kind of thematic control. I think is something that I really like, and that's something that I like in a lot of. We talked a little bit about Arthur Machen with Forrest Aguirre, and same thing with that, and with a number of the sort of writers that have kind of come after him in that particular mode of horror. That they I think really do that type of that particular, those two dials are under really tight control, and maybe less tight control on some of the other stuff that other types of horror might be more interested in, like a really, really tight story, where this one kind of spends a little while getting going, but it's at the trade-off is that kind of really excellent tonal control that, you know, the entire way, even as it's getting going, you can have that kind of eerie feeling going on without a whole lot of actual kind of overt horror stuff. It's mostly just about how the main character couldn't see what's going on, right? Almost every description, the first third of the story, is some version of, I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it kind of made me feel weird.
Arthur Machen is a really good parallel. Algernon Blackwood is another one in that kind of frame. One thing you'll notice about this, and I agree, Hodgson is very hit and miss. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you go out and just start consuming him. You know, everything he's ever written, but you'll notice there's very little dialogue in this, and Hodgson is kind of known for that, not having a lot of dialogue. And I don't know if that's where he's building that control over the tone and such. Maybe dialogue would get in the way of it. I don't know. You don't really notice it while you're reading, but later you think, oh, nobody really.
They didn't talk much. I like
some other authors, I think, that have that similar sort of tonal horror, I think, do similar, right? A number of Machen stories, the White People in particular, is really basically just the character reminiscing about events. There's I think almost no dialogue at all. I'm thinking about an author that I really love is Julien Gracq, who's a little later, but French author who wrote a number of really excellent things. But The Castle of Argol, or Chateau d'Argol, is my favorite of his, and it's a story where there is a fair bit of implied dialogue, but I don't think there is any actual dialogue at all, and it's this wonderful kind of gothic castle on the coast of Brittany that is this kind of fascinating tale. And maybe I'll convince Hobbs to read it, maybe not. He's kind of rolling his eyes, so I'm not sure he'd be into Julien Gracq.
It wasn't because of that. It's because I saw some drop frames again. That's why I was rolling my eyes. It was the look of disappointment, not the look of dejection of having to read some crazy thing that Arlen wanted to read.
Hobbs has double duty. He has to sound intelligent and watch all the dials and everything. So
I don't. I'm here for the lowbrow, Ray. I'm not even supposed to sound it. Anything I say that even looks or even appears intelligent or knowledgeable is purely by accident and just bonus. But I was going to say, when it edges like at the turning point of George, the story kind of begins to change when he says, "No, I dare not," replied the voice, and it seemed to me that in its tones I detected a note of stifled craving, as though the owner hushed a mortal desire. It came to me then in a flash that the poor old creature out there in the darkness was suffering for actual need, for that which Will held in his arms, and yet, because of some unintelligible dread, refraining from dashing to the side of our schooner and receiving it. And with lightning-like conviction there came the knowledge that the invisible was not mad, but sanely facing some intolerable horror. So that kind of reminds me of like Lovecraft or something, but it would be like at the end when he would, make this, oh my God, it's a huge epiphany or revelation that you're supposed to be stupefied into. But this is like really the beginning of the story in many ways, when they finally, just give the dude some food. Yeah. I thought that was pretty interesting. Like Ray was saying, it kind of almost ends the framing part of it. And then it's like, okay, now we're going to get the real story of what happened.
we don't doubt that something horrible has happened to this person. By the time he starts telling his story, we're primed to think it's going to be bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, yeah, it really does set it up. I mean, when somebody is starving, but they are, but they won't come and get the food because they're afraid of something else, right? You know, that's bad.
Yeah, for sure. I totally think so. What, you got any thoughts on that, Arlen?
I think I just echo what you guys have said. There's definitely we don't know what it is that has gone wrong or that is afflicting this character yet, but we have a real sense of its gravity from his behavior.
Do you think that this framing aspect is something deeper in the story, where, like, when you said something about, when you were asking about it, Ray, you said shining the light on. Is it like almost foreshadowing of trying to understand the ununderstandable? Or is this am I like on too much CBD today?
I think it's, if we could take the horror away from it for a second, it's a story about encountering like a desperate situation, right? So one of the things that is often true of sea stories, right, is that you when you go to sea, you can very easily, through a freak of weather or whatever, can end up in a really bad place, right, where you're running out of food, you don't know where you're at, all this kind of stuff. And so you have these very you have this boat full of people who are well off. They've got so much food that they can afford to give as much of it as this person wants. They said you can have all the food you want, right? They're representing safety and comfort, and then it's an encounter with the other, right? And so I think it's that in itself is kind of interesting, because we have those brushes in our lives, right, where it's very easy to think about something academically or superficially, but when you make contact with it, it's a whole different thing. And whether that's it could be as simple as something as people with disabilities, for instance. I don't have anybody in my immediate family or my immediate contacts that have severe disabilities, and so I don't come into contact with it that much. But then some days I'm around people who are challenged, and you know, it becomes real to me, right? And I think this is a story about that, about coming face to face with desperation and horror in a way that's meaningful.
Interesting. Arlen? I got nothing, but I'm going to tell you.
I really like that. I think that is a great way to think about this story, because while the horror is so much of the tone, this kind of the actual story really is about this meeting and this encounter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good way to sort of parcel out the different things, the different ways, and to talk about the ways that this story works. And especially once you get into trying to adapt something like this for at the gaming table, right? Mm-hmm. When you're sort of building a story like this, I think you start with sort of those different ingredients separate and bring them together, rather than starting like this, where kind of the whole picture has been painted already, right? You kind of have to start with like, okay, here's what I'm going to have go on in the actual events of this sequence, and here's what I'm going to have go on in the characters' reactions, and here's what I'm going to have go on in the tone of their narration, and put all those different pieces together into one kind of set piece for the players to experience.
I know I'm jumping in to talk a lot here, but there's another thing I wanted to say about this one, which is there's the kind of horror story where people are being punished for dumb actions, right? Where a scientist is so full of hubris that he doesn't ask whether he should, he just wants to know whether he can, right? And so he ends up making Godzilla or whatever. And then there's this kind of story, which is just bad things happen to people sometimes, right? Yep. Nobody did anything in this story to deserve any of this, right? And I think that coupled with the time it was written, you know, is kind of interesting. This is written by a person. Well, I guess he was 30 when he wrote this, and he wasn't involved in the war yet, but he had been to sea and seen deprivation. And, you know, it's this idea of a time when we live in a pretty comfortable world, even in COVID. It's weird to say that now. We're face to face with something like this now, but in a time when you didn't have vaccines for all of these horrible, tetanus and polio and all these other diseases. Hodgson himself was one of like 12 kids, and 3 of them died in infancy. So he's familiar with this. Like, just sometimes really bad things happen to people. And I think in gaming, it's always great if you can somehow present a world of scarcity, or a world where things are just rough. And it's not, we tend to think a lot about cause and effect in gaming. Like, you make dumb choices, you're going to end up in a bad place. But sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it's just a bad place to start with. And it's how are you going to endure or suffer through?
Yeah, no kidding. I like it. I had some other thoughts, but I think I lost them from my disgust with losing.
We could probably bridge over into the other part of this tale, though, now, and start talking about the...
Yeah, I agree. So basically, this unknown person finally explains the horror that he goes through in pretty good detail, right? To me, this story felt slower than the framing at the beginning, to be honest. Does that sound weird? I don't know. But he went into it in such detail and almost detached detail, because it's all like monologue from the guy. Like, there's none of the, like, here I heard his voice break when he mentioned the first time he came to her and she was eating the food or something, I don't know. It's all,
oh my gosh. He sets you up for lines, doesn't he? Like, it's you're right in the sense that in the first half, you've got multiple characters, and there is some simulation of action. There's a boat coming to and fro. There's food being drifted out to this guy. But in this part, it's just one person chronicling sort of one detail after another, and it's going to a bad place. And by the time there's should we give a quick kind of overview of what's happening?
Sure, go ahead.
Because I think before we start talking about what some of the lines where they so basically the story is this gentleman and his wife were on a boat with some other people. They got into a bad storm, heavy mist. By the way, you notice the mist is like something common to both situations, right? Heavy mist, boat sinking. I can't remember why it's sinking, but it's sinking, and everybody else leaves the ship and leaves them behind, right? And so they have to cobble together a raft. They end up on an island, and they find another shipwreck on the island, and at first they think that's going to be their salvation, but of course that one is old as well, and it's covered in fungus. Now, he doesn't seem to distinguish, Hodgson doesn't seem to distinguish between fungus and lichen, and I'm no botanist, so I'm not sure I could really, get into the details of all that, but it's covered in gray lichen and fungus and all this kind of stuff, and they go about trying to make home there, right? It's could be like one of those post-apocalyptic, like, cozy catastrophe stories where they're going to sort of build back up from nothing, but it isn't that, right? Because they come to find out that the ultimate enemy is the fungus itself. They can't seem to keep it cleaned away. And then one day we get this line, "On the 7th morning, my sweetheart woke to find a small patch of it growing on her pillow close to her face." And I was like somehow, when you get to that line, I'm like, ew, yuck.
Yes.
It's like, it's ew, it's on her pillow. It's like, and that
we
really
knew it was going to
me.
happen, though, right?
Yeah, you knew it was going to happen, but somehow having it show up on her pillow close to her face, like while she slept, made it really, and it's just a little mushroom or something. Yeah. A little patch of lichen.
There's an interesting element to this also. One of the details of the story is that it's not his wife, it's his fiance.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes. Sorry.
And that they clean out 2 rooms on the ship and are apparently sleeping separately in 2 different rooms on 2 different beds, all that sort of stuff. And there's a kind of interesting, I think, way that Hodgson, it seems to me, is kind of playing with a lot of sort of our kind of common moralistic expectations about things like sexual politics and all that sort of stuff, to have these 2 characters who are even in this kind of crazy situation maintaining this kind of almost ritualistic form of of their former life that revolves around that. And it would be really easy to read into this, I think, a connection with a man and a woman alone in this kind of weird world that they don't have any understanding of. And then eventually with the eating the fungus, I think the Adam and Eve thing is really easy to read into this story.
Yes.
And that's, of course, a really big kind of theological question, because I think most of the various Christian churches in the world hold that Adam and Eve were not sexually active with each other before the fall. But in John Milton's version of the story, he certainly heavily implies that they were, and that has become a kind of that has sort of taken over one version of the imagined form of Eden, right? And so I think there's something really interesting going on there with these characters and the way that they kind of attempt to maintain their former life in this strange situation, and the way that it falls apart in the kind of particulars.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I definitely was going to bring up the Garden of Eden kind of mentality here. There's a lot going on there. I mean, you're in this island, and it's not a paradise. It's sort of the opposite of a paradise, but it is fecund. It's fertile, right? There's things growing all over it. There is a weakness here in the story in terms of our kind of modern thinking. If there's a problematic part of the story, it's that his fiance is a relatively weak character. Doesn't do much, needs sort of shepherding everywhere, and is the one who succumbs first, right? Yeah. Both in terms of being infected and in terms of temptation, right? And so that it is kind of a story, ultimately, it gets into a story about temptation, about eating these fungi and hastening the end, if you will. Like they know what's going to happen anyway, but there's a sort of a slow track there and a fast track there. Yeah. And it's also about purity, right? It's about, which is kind of there's some bad places you could probably go there too, but it's about, their blood being tainted with this fungal infusion, if you will.
Well, I thought it was really interesting. One of the ideas that a lot of the description of the island and the ship and all that sort of stuff, there's a repeated phrase about no signs of life or nothing living or anything like that. And obviously we know that's not true. Fungus is a living thing, which
yes.
kind of creates a really interesting, I think it creates a kind of it's almost a sort of clever form of literary myopia, I guess you might say, that he's kind of perceiving this as something, or attempting to perceive this as something kind of dead and non-threatening, when we know from our knowledge of genre and what type of story this is, as well as eventually the events of the story itself, that this is not just a living thing because it is biologically living, but it is a living thing because it is an agent within the story for a lot of what happens in this tale. Because the fungus seems to have if not a kind of sentient mentality, it does have a sort of overarching will that coincides with the direction of the narration.
Yeah, you're right. It's almost a character in the story in a way. Yeah. And it is what you said is really interesting when he says no living thing. You're right. We presume he means no signs of animate, like people or birds or mammals or anything. Yeah. But of course the plant kingdom is alive. Too much so in the story. Yeah, that's a great. Although you notice how it's described, it's even though it's aggressively alive, it's also it's more like death in a way than life, right? And the way they describe it, for one thing, it's always gray, so it's kind of lifeless in its coloring. It's something they clean away with acid, which I'm not really sure what that means, or what that says, but I noticed that's a kind of they keep bringing out this carbolic acid that they found on the ship, and they're using that to clean it off, and to get rid of it for a while. Yeah. But you're right. It definitely has a will. It's an active agent in the story.
What do you think? I got the impression once they realized that they were kind of stuck here and they couldn't go anywhere else, that now it didn't matter and they could do whatever they wanted, and they were staying in the same little tent which brings me to, what do you think this the white sand that was untouched by the fungus was? Because he kind of mentions it, you know.
Yeah, he says it was, and there's a 4-word sentence where he says it was not sand, but he described there's a smooth white patch of what appeared to be fine sand, and there we landed. It was not sand. What it was, I do not know.
Like bones, or what do you
I
think?
thought the same thing. Like, what was that?
Yeah, is it like the interim? Is it almost like a purgatory between the two or something that it wouldn't cross? I was curious about that because he doesn't really ever go into it. Did you have any thoughts on that, Arlen?
Well, I thought it was. I don't know what it is necessarily, but I think it's really interesting. After it was not sand, he talks about everywhere. Well, the fungus will not grow everywhere else, save where the sand-like earth wanders oddly pathwise amid the gray desolation of the lichen. And this idea that it's not just like a beach; it's like an actual
a path going somewhere.
Going somewhere through the fungus stuff.
We may be reading too much into it, but since you brought it up, the Garden of Eden, Milton's Paradise Lost.
Yeah,
there is this kind of idea of like, I'm thinking like Dante's Inferno as well. Like there's the path, right? The path in biblical terms is straight and narrow. Here it isn't. It's wandering and white and sandy. But but the point is there's a safe path, and if you step off the path, you're gonna get some sin on you. You're gonna get some fungus on you. And I don't know if he's trying to get there or not. I don't really think of it as a moralistic tale, but
no, I don't.
It is interesting how it's described, and there's some thinking there that you could probably do along that line.
I was going to add,
saying you don't think it happened, or you do. Go ahead, Arlen.
One of the really interesting things talking about fungus is that, of course, the relationship between the sort of fungus and death versus fungus and life, right? That fungus is sort of a form of life that is a sign of death because it's feeds on decaying matter and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. It reminds me, Joseph de Maistre has a really interesting argument, a philosophical argument at one point where he says that we should admire executioners and revile soldiers because executioners kill bad people and soldiers kill just sort of like farmhands that have been conscripted. And that this is the opposite of how we sort of normally act because we treat executioners with revulsion and treat soldiers with admirism. And it's sort of reminds me a bit of that in a way, in the sense that this fungus, is it something dead? Is it something living? How do we actually think about it? Because these characters have this sort of complex relationship, especially when they start eating it, right? That they have a real natural urge to eat it as soon as they taste it, that somehow there is a sort of on a basic level, it seems like it sort of perhaps sustains them, at least for a time, when they have no other food, right? But they're also kind of horrified by it and kind of completely repulsed by it and all that sort of stuff. And they describe it as unliving when we know that it's definitely living and all that sort of stuff. So I thought that was kind of an interesting...
I think it is an allegory towards the tasting of, falling into temptation. Yeah. And it's not the death of hunger that will take them, but basically being consumed by their own temptation is what it felt
maybe
like.
Although they're never really like, I think they did erect 2 tents. I think he made 2 tents.
Oh, he did.
So they did sort of maintain that boundary. And I think that's really interesting what you're saying, Arlen. It is true. Like maggots, leeches, anything that breaks flies, ants, anything that sort of breaks things down, we have this revulsion for, because it symbolizes for us like the end, the death, right? Mm-hmm. But there is a noble thing there, right? It's a necessary thing. There's got to be worms. There's got to be whatever, these organisms that break things up. But it's something that I think Hodgson was particularly fascinated with in general. I was reading a little bit about him, and they were talking about his photography, and they said he practiced his photography on the ships he was on, and he would take photographs of and the things they mentioned: aurora borealis, northern lights, sure, cyclones, lightning, sharks, and the maggots that infested the food given to sailors. So like, one of these things is not like the other. The northern lights are pretty. Everything else on there are destructive forces, right? Things that tear down, that undo mankind, right? It's the end of civilization, these natural forces. And you can't help but wonder why they struggle so much against this at some point. You think, well, okay, you've got no hope of rescue. There's no way to clean this fungus off of you. It tastes good. It makes you feel good when you eat it. Why do they struggle against it so much? It's kind of like, why do they still sleep in separate tents, as you were pointing out?
Yeah. Well, and there's also an element, one of the things to go along those lines, that they have this sort of kind of what we might call like a sixth sense about the kind of the nature of the fungus and all that sort of stuff, that also when our narrator, the man, he encounters what he believes to be the fully grown over fungus version of one of the crew of the original ship. Mm-hmm. It's really unclear to me why it is that he thinks that this has to be one of the ship's crewmates, other than the fact that he sort of sees a shape that he thinks is like an arm and it feels like it reaches out to him. But I wasn't sure why. Maybe you guys have something to comment on that, but he definitely says, like, this is, I think this is what happened to this is like the last of the crew members of the ship that we found. And I was kind of surprised by that.
What did you think of that scene, Jason?
Do you think are you feeling like it's bad writing that he just decides that?
No, I don't think it's bad writing. I just think it's kind of surprising to me, because I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that, but I can totally see why your mind would go that direction in that kind of situation, right? Like, it's true from a psychological perspective, even if it's not necessarily kind of scientifically provable.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, it's interesting. I mean, I kind of figured that all along, so it's not necessarily bad that he did it, but it just, the vile arm brushed across my face.
It's so creepy. Let's talk about this section. It says, here it is. Turning quickly, I saw that there was movement among an extraordinarily shaped mass of fungus close to my elbow. It was swaying uneasily as though it possessed life of its own. Abruptly, as I stared, the thought came to me that the thing had a grotesque resemblance to the figure of a distorted human creature. Even as the fancy flashed into my brain, there was a slight sickening noise of tearing, and I saw that one of the branch-like arms was detaching itself from the surrounding gray masses and coming towards me. The head of the thing, a shapeless gray ball, inclined in my direction. I said stupidly, and the vile arm brushed across my face. So this is how he gets his first taste, right, of the shrooms. Shrooms. But yeah, I think it is one of the crew that got turned, but maybe I am biased because my first exposure to this story in a way was the movie that it was made into, the Japanese horror film Matango. And so that I find it somewhat compelling that that's what happened to the crew, but it wouldn't have it. But it's certainly animated in some way, right? The mushrooms here are the lichen is animated. It's moving.
Mm-hmm.
The arm detached itself.
I didn't disagree with the narrator that's what was happening. I just assumed that was correct because I didn't see any point in looking any deeper, I guess. What were your thoughts, Arlen? Further, I guess, after we say that.
I don't know. I guess it seemed like a kind of curious case of anthropomorphism, but at the same time, I really agree with him. Yeah, if I was in that situation, I'm sure that's exactly what I would think. And reading it, I'm pretty sure that's one of the crew members. But I don't necessarily know kind of exactly why it is that seems such a kind of strong possibility to me.
Do you notice when he eats it, he sees his hands full of this stuff now because he's got a taste, right? Mm-hmm. And he starts gorging himself on it, and he says it was sent by God. Mm-hmm. I thought that was an interesting line, basically exactly. Manna from heaven, right? But sort of the opposite of manna from heaven.
Well, the temptation thing again that forces it, and then once you have a bit of it, you can't have just one, right? So,
well, manna from heaven is an interesting because manna has no flavor. Supposedly, that's like one of the biblical things, right? Is like they got tired of it because it was basically tasteless.
Oh, okay.
if I remember right. Maybe I'm getting my Sunday
I
school
don't
lessons
know.
wrong, but but that was the sustaining force. This is not it sustains in a way, right? It transforms, I guess. It's parasitic.
So
yeah.
So what I found interesting, so basically this is what happens, and they gave them the food, and because they're not eating the fungus anymore, so that's why they're so grateful to have the food. And then as they move away, the thoughtful stray beam of light kind of shows an indistinct sponge, a great gray nodding sponge as the oars continued to ply. So what I immediately thought was, he wasn't afraid or ashamed of how he looked, but he didn't want them to get
infected.
Yeah, infected, exactly the word I was looking for. He didn't want them to get infected, but he wanted the food anyway. That's why he was away, not because he was necessarily concerned. Excuse me.
I think both those things are true. I felt like he was but maybe he was afraid that the fishermen seeing him would be so horrified that they wouldn't give him food
or kill him.
I don't know. Yeah, right.
All right, so I mean that pretty much is the end of the story.
Not much happens. You could tell the story in like 2 sentences, right?
Well, I mean, almost any story you could do that, right? I mean,
that's true. I guess
guy born, guy died. That was my life, Ray. So like, I mean, and I even read a little bit of where they think different things were inspired by this. But I mean, I have ran multiple different sessions of games that use this idea. Like the Juju Zombie is almost totally in D&D, right? And AD&D was where I remember first seeing it, maybe, or late in the Monster Manual. Basically, a plant-like thing that infects people, and then they become it's the plant's thralls, and go out, and their most important thing is spreading it. And I mean, I've always kind of used that with a horror like this, where they don't know what's happening. They see a plant, they fight on it. Spores get put in. Oh, make a saving throw. What happens? Oh, I don't know, but you failed your saving throw, and I can remember a very explicit.
Your hands are clammy for some odd reason.
I can remember a very explicit session where one of the players came back to an NPC that was with them and found the guy all splayed up in a plant himself, and just when he was surprised by that and the horror of what was going on, he was like,
well, I think of rock grubs and yellow slime or green slime, right? Yellow mold, green slime. I always forget which is which, but they have similar.
Yes.
Parasitic or transformative powers.
Now, just recently in my White Sands game, the group encountered what's the beetle that like has the boar beetle or something that it actually infests a parasite and then they can control.
Oh, you mean in real life?
Yeah, in real life.
Yeah, there's different fungi in real life that do this. One of them infects ants, and it makes them crawl to the top of grass blades where they're more easily eaten by birds. Who then it's like a whole cycle, right? There's a number of these things like that are deadly, like this fungi in particular.
Yeah.
There's also slime molds, which where there's some funny story about how the movie The Blob came from a slime mold outbreak in Texas, and I think I was listening to a chemistry teacher one time who was talking about it. He was saying how he put it in his mom's shoes, and it would like overnight it would turn into like a bunch of slime. It was kind of like a trick they would play on each other. But slime molds are they've done a lot of neat experiments with them because they have kind of a network mentality, right? That they can learn, they can find their way through mazes by growing. And it's really creepy stuff when you start digging into this, how certain forms of slime and fungi behave, if you will.
That makes me think of The Thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's another one that belongs in that category.
So like I've already used something very similar to this, and like I say, I can think of explicitly 2 very lurid definitions or descriptions of using this idea in a game. Arlen, have you used something like this, or do you remember playing in a game that someone used something like this?
I don't think I've ever used something like this. And part of that is, for whatever reason, I seem to very rarely run particularly horror heavy sessions. I think I can, count on one hand the number of times that I've had like a session that really leaned into the horror. Although I did one time, Che Webster described a session that I ran as ferociously weird. So
Mm.
that was
Yeah, he's
I like
British,
that.
though. Everything's ferociously weird for those guys.
well, that's about as horror as I get, is ferociously weird. In terms of playing, I'm trying to think of stuff like this. Definitely, I've had. There's a session of Call of Cthulhu that I remember playing where my character suffered a pretty serious sanity loss on seeing kind of the sign of decay inside a building that it was dark inside, and he kind of pushed aside the collapsing roof and the sort of mushrooms on the blood almost type thing.
Mm.
A serious loss of sanity for that character, and I thought that was a fun sequence. But I don't know if I've ever played anything with quite as much, or run anything certainly with as much sort of intelligence to a creature like this. I think it's always been more kind of the fungus or signs of decay as kind of a sign standing in for whatever horrific thing happened, more so than the fungus or the source of decay as kind of the source of horror itself.
It's not a very roll for initiative kind of monster, is it?
No, it's not in a lot of ways.
But I do think that so suspenseful horror is notoriously hard to build sometimes at the table. You got to have the right group, etc., atmosphere. That topic's been done to death. But I do think just the idea of, so if we forget the fungus part of it for a minute, the idea of scarcity can be a really horrific thing. And so I'll give an example. A friend of mine up in Montreal, Jocelyn Robitaille, he I was coming up there to visit, and in basically in just to be nice to me, he converted. He decided he was going to run Dark Sun because I'd never played in Dark Sun and I'd always wanted to play in Dark Sun, and he converted it to Savage Worlds, which was brilliant, by the way, worked great. We ended up playing 3 sessions of this like a year apart, so it was like a trilogy of movies almost. But I remember one of the first things that happened to us in this Dark Sun game was we were out in the desert, we had run out of water, and we were going to die, and we happened on this caravan, of people, a small number of people, and they had water, and it's like, what will you do to get it? Because they haven't done anything to you, right? Like, are you going to turn into murder hobos and kill these people to get the water? Are you going to, because if you don't, you're going to die. And it was just like, it was this horrible moral choice that we had to make in the moment, Well, it was even harder for me because I was a halfling, so I was looking at a source of water and food. So,
but aren't halflings cannibals? Yeah, I was going to
say.
That's
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Well, they're not cannibals. They don't eat other halflings. They eat, or they might, but they eat other races, right? So yeah, I'm looking at this thing thinking smorgasbord. But that kind of thing is fun to set up, I do think.
I feel like all of my sessions, almost all of them, have an element of horror in them. I think that's a thing that I really lean into and create that suspense and that tension that exists when you don't really know what's happening, but it just feels wrong. Like you have that intrinsic sense that, okay, feels like me. If I was running the game, it wouldn't have been that you had to kill them. It would be, oh, something seems slightly wrong with these people. Is something in the water? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But maybe that simplistic decision that has so many complication to it is even better. Maybe, I don't know, to create a memorable session. I don't know.
Well, it's a different flavor of horror, right? There's a sort of horror that is based on kind of what's external to the character or the person or something like that. And there's a horror that's about what's kind of internal to the character and the person, right? There's a whole flavor of horror that's about like, what sort of person would you turn into if you didn't have the advantages that you had in life, right? If you had to grow up in the
Right.
Stone Age and had to, kill for your food and all that sort of stuff, what sort of person would you be? And I think that can be really compelling, right? And role playing games actually, I think, do a really good job of that sort of horror in a lot of ways, because we can kind of explore those directions and opportunities without having to do horrible things ourselves, right? Whereas in I think sometimes the kind of fear for the character's life or something like that can be a little less. When I play Call of Cthulhu, often there's always a little bit of the back of my head that's like, I'm playing this game where the character is going to get messed up, and I know that, and so I don't feel nearly as much of the kind of concern for my character's skin as I would for my skin if I was in that situation, because I sort of know that this is a conceit of the game and this is sort of what we do in this game. And that's not necessarily bad. And a lot of people have a lot of fun playing Call of Cthulhu, but I think it's about kind of creating the particular flavor of horror that you're going for at your table and trying to get your players to buy into that flavor of horror. And I agree, Jason. I think a ton of your sessions are either like 20 or 30% horror, or up to like 60 or 70.
Mm-hmm. But it's not there. I mean, there is some body horror, and my forte is lurid description buffered by goofy NPCs.
That's probably actually more fun. I mean, the kind of horror we were faced with there isn't always fun for people, right?
Yeah.
You don't necessarily want a therapy session. You just murdered a caravan for water. How does that make you feel? Right? I mean, like, well, I feel like crap, But yeah, so I get it. I at the same time, people that aren't willingly complicit in the horror sometimes, like if they don't get into character or whatever, can also be problematic. One of the things I didn't like about running Call of Cthulhu when I used to do that quite a bit was, especially at cons, was that some people would treat it like a race to crazy, like how fast can I go crazy? And I'd be like, really? That's if we're just going to do that, this session's going to, we're going to have some laughs and it's going to be over fast, and and only one character is going to survive, and they'll probably be the insane one. So it's tricky to play with that. So I'm congratulations to you, Jason, for making that work a lot. I know, especially in old school style play, it can really be done well, right? Setting up that description and the suspense, and because you're not going to the rules a lot, so you've got some room to really kind of stretch and be in the environment, and the kind of question and answer thing that gets set up in when you're not using a character sheet or rules for everything, it lends itself to that, right? Like your ability to come to grips mentally with a situation and try to figure a way out of it, or
because it's
figure
more
out what's going on.
It's player focused as much as it's character focused, right? But I should clarify, that's what I run, but I'm not saying I do a good job of it.
Oh, okay. Well, fair.
I'm not saying I do a great job of it, but I'd say that's kind of the tone that a lot of my games have. And I don't even know if
I think I can say that you do a good job with it. In the sessions that I played with you, it's definitely had that well done horror feel. I remember one in particular was just like a pickup game that you invited me to with three of us, and we encountered like a weird, like a Frankenstein's monster that was part horse, and it was real nasty and very horrific.
That was White Sands. That turned into that was like the middle portion of the pickup game of White Sands between two campaigns. That's funny. I didn't remember you were in that. Stu
I was
plays
only in
that
the
dwarf.
one session, but
Stu still plays that character that got his face messed up by that horse chimera. And down beneath that area is where they ran into that moss stuff that I was talking about that controlled people. So
given our short story, I find it a little ironic that you call your game White Sands.
We're getting double Ray for.
Yeah, we are getting double raid. I don't know why.
What did I do?
I think you're unmuted on Discord.
Yeah, you're unmuted on Discord, my brother.
There we go. Got it.
All right.
Right?
All right.
Go ahead. You say that again. Call the game White Sands, and then the White Sand in this story. You mean?
I think it's ironic that given our story that you call your game White Sands. Yes, that's what I was saying.
That's pretty good, my man. All right. So
is it sand really?
Why don't we wrap up how we feel about the story now? Did anything change after the discussion? Arlen?
I don't really think
Yeah.
anything changed for me, to be honest. I appreciate the story a lot, but I did before. I kind of thought it was really fun. It was a lot of fun to talk about it with you guys, certainly. Um, I think there's a lot. It's impressive that there's so much packed into what is really like in print. It's only like 10 pages,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's not a lot that happens in the story in the sense of like Chekhov's gun style stuff, but there's a
Hmm.
lot of stuff that happens in the sense of like what these characters go through that is all kind of compelling and believable and all that sort of stuff. And so
Yeah, there's
yeah, I still like it.
a great tersity to the story, but it still seems good. What about you, Ray? Do you got anything?
Yeah, well, I'd echo that. It's a as story economy and structure goes, it's a really nice example. And I also agree that I can't believe how much stuff is really worth talking about in here. I thought when I picked this, when I reread it, I thought, gosh, this only takes like 10 minutes to read. How are we going to talk about it for an hour? And I started looking at all his other works, like his Karnaki stories and House on the Borderland and the Nightland and some other things that he'd written. I thought, oh, we can talk about these things, but we didn't need to because there's just a lot that's interesting in the story. And honestly, if anything, I sort of want to read it again now and contemplate like what is it he's really trying to say with some of these things. Like, is the white sand kind of an some kind of metaphor or allegory? I don't know. He doesn't strike me as particularly allegorical or metaphorical as an author, though. I don't think there's a lot of deep meaning in his other things necessarily. Like, he's not trying to beat you over the head with some kind of message. It's just a good, suspenseful, creepy story.
Is it ever just a story, Ray?
Yeah, right. Is it ever just a cigar?
It is funny the way that it's different too, because the last thing we read was The Hollow by William Morris, aside from Malazan.
Okay.
I think The Hollow takes a very different approach, that there's a similar way in that there's a lot of kind of stuff that is not really explained in terms of what it all means. But The Hollow, it feels to me, has a much stronger kind of like
Connotations.
layer almost, that there's sort of a double layer to what Morris has created, whereas this, it seems like so much of it is sort of on the surface. It's not William Hope Hodgson trying to tell you about sin. It's William Hope Hodgson trying to tell you about suffering. If that makes sense as a distinction,
Right.
versus William Morris is telling you about sin.
Well, in 1907, there was
all that. Yeah.
I was going to say in 1907, there's a lot less competing for your attention.
Yeah.
And I think authors had the luxury of expecting a captive audience in a way that maybe modern authors have to keep trying to grab your attention for every few pages. Maybe that's why modern horror is all about the jump scare and the splatter, and old horror is all about building the suspense. That's a big generalization and simplification, but I think there's some truth to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. So, Ray, we got you here.
Right.
Do you want to take some time maybe and talk about like projects you're working on or anything that you got going on?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a creator by nature, right? So I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in painting and some degrees in literature and stuff. Doesn't matter. But the point being that I just have this side to me. I've always been a person who makes things. And so for me, a lot of these projects are about just the need to create something. I get really fascinated by something or interested in something, and I kind of dive into it, right? So I've got a number of little games that you can get for free, and some zines that you can get for free out there at rayotus.itch.io. One of them is a series of zines, Plundergrounds, which is a fantasy zine written for Dungeon World, but really generic enough you could use it for anything. There's 7 or 8 issues of that. There's one written for Old School Essentials, which is kind of a rules look at analysis at like breaking down treasure types and monsters and some things. There and Back Again is a little game I wrote about the 1937 edition of The Hobbit, which if you don't know the story, The Hobbit was revised later on in the 50s to be more in line with Lord of the Rings. And so it's really quite a different feel if you read the 37 version. Gollum's a lot nicer guy in the 1937 version. He's really worried about cheating, actually, which is funny. Well, and anybody can be a wizard and all this kind of. So there's that. I got a handful of things like that. Like Goblin Town, I wrote because I wanted to write a game about down and out people, like the lowest of the fantasy races, no resources, right? Like, what do you do to save your village, kind of thing.
Isn't the kobold though?
Yeah.
Isn't the kobold the least? I mean, like 1 or 2 less
maybe
points than a goblin.
You think goblins pick on kobolds? Which that's a good question. Who looks down on the other? Probably.
maybe they just think of themselves as equals and they just like to hang out, play games, and invite anybody. I don't know. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry, Ray.
No, that's good. That's good. We know that it's tribalism, so they actually like turn on each other in ugly ways. That's how it has to be, really. No, and so I'm just going to say there's a number of these projects out there. Feel free to have a look, and if you enjoy any of them, drop me a line or make a note there on itch.io, and I kind of live for that. I mean, it's great to make something. It's even greater to share it with people, and the greatest thing of all is when they enjoy it and share it again.
Yeah, I was gonna say, man, I forgot again. Anyway, Arlen, what you got? Any last words? Oh, I guess we should say before we do last words, if someone that's where you would want them to contact you, Ray, is on Itch.io.
Yeah, or they can just email me. It's just rayotus@gmail.com. I try to shy away from social media these days. I'm out there, but I periodically flee from it because it is what it is.
Mm-hmm. I get you.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Arlen, you want to talk about ways that the fans, the rest of the society, could get into their secret membership of the Libram Society?
Yeah, so if you want to get a special decoder ring that is like the ones that used to come in cereal boxes, you can you can email us at thelibramsociety@gmail.com or at Libram Society on Twitter, or on Hobbs's Gamerhood Discord. There's a Libram Society channel, and we talk about that and share what we're going to read and all that sort of stuff. And in particular, I don't know if it's up in the YouTube description or anything like that yet, but we'll probably put it up there. We're going to put up a schedule with what we're trying to get through each day of the Libram Society, so that we who knows if we'll actually get through it, because we planned on getting through a little more of Malazan last time than we actually did, but hopefully we'll get into a good rhythm, and that way you'll be able to see kind of what's coming up and buy your books and get ready to read along with us and all that sort of stuff. So schedule at Libram Society on Twitter, Libram Society at the Libram Society at gmail.com. And Hobbs and I are both also on Twitter, and Hobbs's YouTube channel, you can leave comments there. Hobbs's Twitch, you can leave comments there. There's lots of ways to get in contact with us, and we will definitely share them between us. Share anything if you want to say, nice words about Ray. Thanks for coming on as our guest, Ray. That's nice words from me. But nice words from the fans would be great too, and we'll pass those along to Ray also.
I have two questions for you.
It was
Ray.
a great time.
You're not off the hook yet. Which is next, Liavek or Thieves' World?
Oh my gosh, you're gonna be surprised. I've not read either of those.
Oh, that's it. Then that's a good answer.
I know, right? So I can't really answer, but somehow my gut is telling me Liavek.
I like it. All right, one last question.
Yes.
Del Rey, Bantam, or Tor?
Oh my gosh, Del Rey, Bantam, or Tor? I do like those Del Rey covers, right?
All right.
Yeah, I think Del Rey.
Yeah, I'm always surprised. I surprise Forrest with this question. Go ahead. I'm curious to hear. Anything else? No.
No. Oh, I will say this: if you want a really cheesy take on this story, please go watch the 1963 Ishiro Honda movie Matango. It's also sometimes called Attack of the Mushroom People. I saw it as a elementary school kid who would every day, as soon as the bus got home, I would run into my house to watch the movie that started at 3:00. I think I got home at like 3:15, right? So I'd always miss the beginning of it, and it would always be like Godzilla or Reptilicus or Them. Or one of these. It was the $3 million movie, they called it. It started at 3:00. It was a monster movie. And when I saw this one as a kid, it totally messed me up in a good way. So it's worth seeing.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. All right. I will go ahead and echo Arlen and say, really appreciate you coming on and joining us here. I mean, I've had Forrest Aguirre and Ray Otus. I'm in chat now, mentioned guest stars big time now. So I'm in chat now. I was pretty impressed. You got anything at the YouTube you want to share, Arlen?
Yeah, Fred Daniels says, cool talk, everyone. Interesting author I don't think I have ever read. Well, Fred, the story we read is only like 10 pages, so
And it's free online. So
it's free online, so no excuses.
all right, so I started to hit the music. I'm going to hit it again. You guys won't be able to hear it, but you just got to sit there. Thanks again, guys, for joining us. Next week, Malazan. The week after that, let's tune in to find out.
Yeah, we'll have to decide.
All right, now is there any magic way I'm supposed to shut down Tri